This tank chat's going to be about this vehicle, the A1E1 Independent as it was known.
This video has been made possible by our supporters on Patreon, our YouTube members and our super thanks donors. Please join them if you can and support the Tank Museum. And thanks for watching.
Now first things first, I want to take you back to a wet day at Camberley in 1926. The First World War's only just been over for 8 years. Remember the tanks Britain had at the end of the war. There's a display for what was called the Dominion presidents or premiers, and they'd all come to London. They were taken down to Camberley, and then through the rain, the mist, this enormous beast paraded across in front of them. And it was announced as Britain's new heavy tank, an experimental model. It was shown off there. As you can imagine, the press thought it was amazing, but it only paraded past them, and then it went off to its own secret pen area, so it wasn't going to be seen again that particular day. Why was this a significant tank? Well, after the First World War, you can see all those debates were starting about mobility, about what the potential for the armoured vehicle could be in the future. Think of Fuller arguing, what's the chance of putting together a mobile armoured force that can manoeuvre and perhaps even do independent actions on the battlefield. Britain is one of the few countries, in fact pretty much the only country, that says it's going to hang on to a tank force and a tank corps. America gets rid of its tank corps. France decides it's going to put them out with the infantry. We carry on experimenting in Britain. There was actually initially a fair bit of money available, and they keep pushing a vehicle, Johnson's medium D tank, that might be able to meet that requirement for speed and mobility, even amphibious, get around the place and put some of Fuller's ideas into practice. But at the end of 1923, they do away with what was the official government tank design factory. The idea now is going to be that you're going to go to one company in Britain, and that's going to be Vickers. Vickers are now going to design the tanks for you. And it just so happened in 23 as well, Johnson's medium D, it really sort of kind of runs out of steam, and they cancel that project. Now the army knows it's going to need a new generation of tanks, so it goes to Vickers and it starts what was the originally called the Vickers light tank. We then move on to the Vickers medium. But in late 1922, December of 1922, the War Office hands Vickers a requirement for a heavy tank. And when you read that requirement, you realise whatever we're talking about mobility, the War Office still has a fear we are going to have another war that is going to be like the First World War, and therefore we're going to need a World War I-like heavy tank to be able to engage the enemy on the battlefield and probably cross that type of battlefield we all imagine World War I was, i.e. trenches, barbed wires, chewed up ground, etc. This is the specification the War Office actually gave to Vickers. They say this vehicle has got to go at 7 miles an hour. Not that fast really. It's got to climb a 30-degree slope. It's got to be able to cross a 9-foot wide German trench. It's got to be clear of the ground by 18 inches. It needs to have at least a 3-pounder gun with 2 machine guns. Ground pressure, 12 psi, pounds per square inch there. The gun, when it's fitted, has got to go next to the driver. So right at the front of the vehicle, and they allow it to have a 30-degree arc of fire at that front there. Machine guns that are going to be fitted, the two, they want those on sponsons on the side of the vehicle. And they're suggesting they may want to go for a horizontally opposed engine, keep the profile of the vehicle, the height of the vehicle as low as possible. If you've got a flat engine, means you don't have to build such a high cab to an engine compartment to house it. And they also specify they want the tracks in a straight line from the idler wheel at the back to the sprocket at the front. So that was their requirements given to Vickers late in 1922. They say to Vickers, okay, off you go and make this. Vickers says, okay, should we do this for free? And basically the War Office says, no, we're going to pay you 250 guineas. It's for drawings but we realise these are concept drawings. They're drawings that we want to see what you could come up with in this case to meet those specifications. We don't necessarily say these are going to be production drawings. But the good news is we will promise you the contract to build the first of these should we decide to go ahead with a heavy tank idea. The War Office also asked Vickers to design the tank in London, not at one of their outstations in the Midlands or in the Northeast. They say that because they want to be able to engage with the design team at the right times and keep that process going. March 1923, Vickers come back with a set of plans, but there's two sets of plans. One of the vehicles sort of meets the specification that the War Office has given, but actually the second set are radically different. They really are the drawings that you can see that becomes the vehicle behind me, the Independent. This second set of plans has got a vehicle that's about 8 foot 9 inches tall, a very high vehicle. It's going to have 5 turrets on it. It's going to be different from that original specification in quite a other number of ways. 13 millimeters of armour plate going up to 28 millimeters of thickness of armour. And the War Office, when they look at this, they take 30 months before they come to a decision that they then say, and later in 1924, they give the contract. £40,000 is given to build a prototype. And that prototype is going to be this new Vickers idea, not the original specification that they'd originally asked for. So who actually came up with the idea for these changes, we're not too sure about. Whether that was Vickers in discussion with the War Office, whether it was just that debate had changed in those few months, but the idea of a vehicle with the idea of independent action in mind, we'll come to a quote that describes that a bit later, but this idea that you've now got a vehicle that is much wider ranging, speedier, better armour protection and better firepower, and even when that word independent gets associated with the vehicle, inevitably people are thinking this is now a tank that might be able to operate on its own and do work that Fuller's suggesting, not so much that old idea of infantry support and breakthrough as they were in the First World War. But the War Office is going for that Vickers design. Sir George Buckham, who's the guy at Vickers, he's quite a progressive thinker. He's mainly already been associated with gun design over Vickers' histories. He's behind this, we know, to a certain degree, and he's also willing to take his design to talk to the Tank Corps and say, what is it that you need from a vehicle that way? And actually, when Independent is built, it's taken down to Lulworth, it's looked at, the Tank Corps makes comment. Lindsay, in charge of the Tank Corps at the time, he's actually coming out with positive suggestions about this vehicle, and he really rates it as well. So there is thought within the Tank Corps, this may well be a way to go with a new type of heavy tank, not that type of heavy tank that they were thinking of back in the First World War. Now, what's the vehicle going to have? About 13 millimeters of armour protection, as we were saying, going up to about 28 millimeters. It's going to have a new engine designed by Armstrong Siddeley. It's going to be a V12 petrol engine, giving about 350 horsepower. And initially, they're aiming to get to about 20 miles an hour with the weight and the size of the tank as they're originally sort of proposing it. That engine is not going to be cheap. One engine, Armstrong Siddeley, they haven't actually built this particular design yet. They're quoting 27K for a single engine. So a lot of money back then to get this vehicle going. Crew of 8, they think they're going to need in there. 4 separate turrets, each with a machine gunner in. The main turret with a commander and a gunner. They're also looking, the driver's got his own little barbette position at the front. And again, radically, he's actually given a steering wheel, much more the cars type of steering wheel, to be able to drive this vehicle with. The gun is going to be a 3-pounder gun, but if you look at the images of when the first prototype is built, It's actually silvered, and David Fletcher was questioning, is this really a gun at all that they put on there? Because Independent, despite talking about its weaponry, never does gunnery trials. It never fires those guns that it's been fitted with. So this is all a bit hypothetical. And there is thought that maybe that original 3-pounder gun that was fitted was not a working one. It was put in there as a kind of like a space modeler, and just so they could see how that vehicle would operate and whether the turret systems would work that way. They also look at a position for a signaller in the turret as well. But when you get into that turret, it's not that big. So not quite sure where that other person who would be in the turret at the same time as the gunner and the commander are actually going to sort of be able to stand that way. One thing that comes across with the Independent is in the paperwork, every now and again, the War Office are reminding people this is top secret. Don't talk about this. This is an avenue that they don't want other people to know about, that they're going down, experimenting down this route. So again, that radical nature of this design, they want to keep it to themselves very much that way. November 1926, this vehicle is completed. This testbed vehicle is then taken out. We see it's shown off at that Dominion Premiers Conference. Camberley, they're driving it around, they look at this. Initial precious interest, of course, is going to be there. This does look a radically different type of vehicles with these 5 turrets on it. Central turret in the middle with the heavy armament, the 4 sub-turrets round the outside. And we're not quite sure when, because it certainly wasn't during the prototype build stage. At some point, the suggestion is made, one of those turrets becomes an anti-aircraft point. So a machine gun could be fitted that can not only spray, because again, back to that idea of still around, the machine gun's probably still considered the main armament of why you need a tank to suppress enemy positions, enemy troops, etc. This machine gun is potentially there to use against aircraft. So it's this particular turret, they raise its profile and they put an extra hatch on the top, so that hatch can open all the way up, so the machine gun can almost go vertically to be able to fire. Initially, they're looking at Vickers 303 air-cooled machine guns. They've got an idea, Vickers, for an air-cooled machine gun to put into production. That doesn't materialise, and in the end, they're looking at the idea this will be water-cooled machine guns, your traditional 303 Vickers that was put on quite a number of British vehicles, not just in the First World War, but the 20s and 30s as well. One of the problems immediately becomes apparent is transmission. They have trouble when they're driving this vehicle. You're getting through about 4 or 5 gallons of oil an hour just to keep the engine and the transmission running. You can do probably about a mile distance for a gallon of petrol if the going's good at that particular time. They make it so they test it about an 8-foot, doesn't quite do the 9-foot wide trench, it can cross okay. And this idea of the thirstiness of the vehicle, not the end of the world, about 180 gallons of fuel can be carried in 2 separate tanks either side of the engine. So that gives it a reasonable amount of range there. They test the vehicle, it goes on till about 1933, some reports say 1935. But by 1928, they're having to rebuild the transmission at the rear end. And they call back in Walter Wilson, the First World War tank designer, transmission expert, and he fundamentally redesigns the transmission and the rear end of the vehicle. And you can see that was necessary because all the reports coming back to the War Office, it's a litany of slight failures to do with transmission, or the other area, because of the weight of the vehicle, it's now gone to 32 tons. What you're looking at there is the rubber on the road wheels, on the suspension, can't keep up with that sort of pressure. They're peeling off all the time. They go to Ferodo, they go to a number of different manufacturers looking at how might we do best. But the last few years of its testing, this vehicle, the actual road wheels are actually just steel. They're not rubberized at all because, again, with that weight, they just couldn't find a way of keeping the rubber on the tracks, and at certain pressure points that rubber was just peeling away or giving up under the pressure it was under. One of the things that when you study this vehicle, and David Fletcher has just written an article where he looks at one or two of the things we think we know about it, and is it really true? For example, that gun, will it actually be able to do a 360 turn in that turret? Doesn't look possible, because actually these turrets, unless you're going at a very high angle, these turrets interfere with the traverse. So that's one of those things that, again, when you're looking at this design, and it was being looked at because it was radically new, you know, putting 5 turrets, machine guns to fire in all those different arcs around the vehicle. Actually, was that really going to work in practice? There was the idea that there was indicators in the turret, so the commander knew where all his sub-turrets were facing. That's just not the case. There was an indicator in the turret for the commander so he could understand where he was facing in his main turret in relation to the hull of the vehicle, because again, that can get quite confusing. The sub-turrets only had an indicator, again, at what direction they were pointing in. There wasn't a central control one. As you can imagine, that would have taken a fair bit of gearing and effort to be able to work out where every single turret was facing at the same time. Now, we think that, as I mentioned, it doesn't do firing trials, but there is an extractor fan fitted. So when you look at that turret, it's got a cupola for the commander, but there's a mushroom-shaped armoured shield on the other side of the turret, and under there is an extractor fan. But again, we don't think that the gun was ever fired in anger. We know that this vehicle, when it came to the end of the trials, it sat here at Bovington. In the Second World War, it was dragged out, it sat outside, probably as one of those pillboxes or defensive points for the camp. And it was only then that a 3-pounder gun from a Mark I Vickers medium tank was actually fitted that could fire. And if you check again the photographs, that original fitted gun, whether it was real or not, had the recuperator above the barrel. Again, now with the real 3-pounder fitted, the recuperator is underneath the barrel. And again, that was probably put in there just in case there'd been a German invasion in that invasion scare period. This could have been another one of those vehicles that had helped defend this area. When you look at the vehicle, other things that were pointed out, radical at the time, again, under question now, it had a turntable that the commander and the gunner could stand on, and that would turn around. This was considered a first. Now, unfortunately, because of the amount of asbestos within this vehicle, we can't actually check that, because David Fletcher's made the point, actually, you can't really see that on the drawings or in any other area. So is this true, or is this one of these stories that's been made up? I shone a light inside. Yes, you can see a circular turn plate or round shape beneath the turret, but you can't work out at the moment, sadly, from the outside, just using a torch, whether there's any attachments, whether there's actually a motorized turntable, whether that would actually work as it went round at the same time. Because this is one of those areas where this was a vehicle that was considered radical and new by being able to have that. It also had crew compartmentalization. So the idea, they were thinking about crew conditions, keep the engine away from the heat, everything it was generating, away from where the crew position was. Again, a bit of a first here that's going on that way. And they're also looking at things like, just beside me here, the size of this hatch that was used, we think, by crews for entry and exit. Unless you're one of those machine gunners where you went through your own little hatch, you could get out the other way, but it was quite problematic. There was a lot of things in your way getting into the main fighting compartment from a sub-turret. But this one was designed specifically so a stretcher could be fitted inside the vehicle, presumably for a crew member, and then being able to take it out if a crew member was wounded. Whether they ever thought we might be able to pick up a casualty on the battlefield safely, I'm not sure that's really their intention back then, but it might have been. But that idea, that's something that comes out with these conversations that's going on with the Tank Corps. So again, another one of those new and radical bits of designs that way. So does it lead to anything? Well, the British decide they are not going to build a heavy tank, but they are adamant that this has not been a failure. This is from one of the minutes of the War Office meetings that we've got in the archive. The general design of this vehicle has proved of the greatest value in the evolution of more modern tanks. So they didn't consider, ultimately, it was about £150,000 as a waste of money being spent on this particular vehicle. So they don't think that was a waste because they've learnt a lot of other things on this vehicle. So again, you could look at this as a precursor for some of those Soviet vehicles, the T-28, the T-35. The Soviet literature says, no, we won't influence that at all. But do we really believe that? That's one thing. The Germans as well, they were looking at one of these vehicles as the Neubaufahrzeug, this whopping great big vehicle that's going to have a couple of spare turrets on it that the Germans built in the 30s as well. Is that an influence there? Or do we just look at it as a vehicle? If you look at it positively, it's a vehicle Britain learns a lot of things on. It's got a number of firsts on it. It was supposed to have the first coaxial machine gun. There's no actual indication that was ever fitted on this particular vehicle or on the turret there. You know, it does have the first anti-aircraft fitted machine gun for a tank, for taking out aircraft, etc., or protecting itself that way. If that turntable is there, that's going to be the first vehicle that one of those is fitted. So yes, there's some radical ideas there, but the War Office are also saying they're learning a lot of lessons as that goes through its testing up to about 1935 when it's retired here to Bovington. There's one other great story that goes with the Independent. I say great story, it's an interesting story. Back in the late 1920s, a young Scotsman, Bailey Stewart, joins the Seaforth Highlanders, and he's a young officer. He goes out to India. He's fairly disenchanted, and the British MI5 realise someone, a British officer, is trying to get in touch with German authorities, and they intercept some letters, including from the Germans an amount of money in one of those letters. Bailey Stewart is called in for an interview, and this evidence is presented in front of him. And he goes to court, it actually goes to trial. Bailey Stewart is put in the Tower of London. And that was kept fairly secret back at the time. But a British gossip writer who goes on to be a very famous author in this country, Barbara Cartland, she got wind of the fact that there was an officer, a prisoner in the tower, and she published that in one of her gossip columns. And that got out, therefore, to the wider press, and there was a huge amount of interest in this particular trial. Basically, Bailey Stewart had gone to the Germans, offered, what do you after, what do you want? And he goes to Aldershot Military Library and he takes plans of the Independent, along with plans for a new automatic weapon, force formation diagrams, etc. And he's basically selling those to the Germans for money. He's convicted, he goes to prison, he's 5 years, he's released in 1937, he then heads off to Germany, and he actually does propaganda during the war years for the Germans, for Lord Haw as well. And at the end of all of that, they put him in prison again, but in the end they decide they're not going to shoot him as a traitor. Various discussions about this, and he ends up dying as a free person out in Ireland in about 1966. Another one of those little nuggets. We said earlier on about how the British government were quite keen to keep this secret. It had radical ideas with it. This was a time where whatever your latest inventions just didn't get out there on the internet the next day, etc. This was done in a manner that you really didn't want your enemies to know about. And Bailey Stewart, unfortunately for him, decided he was going to sell those secrets, and he was captured doing so, put in prison. But it kind of gave this tank another one of those auras about it as well, because it was the tank that other people wanted to know about.